My name is Diana Sterling, and I spent 15 years as a certified public accountant finding the decimal points that other people tried to bury. I make a living off the fact that people are inherently messy, especially when they think they are being clever. My husband, Mark, was a general contractor who believed that because he could build a skyscraper, he could outsmart a woman who lived in the fine print. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning when the office printer in our hallway coughed out a document he had sent to the wrong queue. I picked up the warm paper, expecting a supply invoice for his latest kitchen remodel. But instead, I found a draft for a $250,000 fraudulent tax filing. It listed a property on Oak Street as a total loss due to water damage. A property I knew he had just finished flipping for a massive profit. Mark, why is our home printer telling me you are committing federal tax evasion? I asked. My voice as cold as an unheated basement. He snatched the paper from my hand, his face flushing the deep, angry red of a man who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. It is just a draft, Diana. So quit acting like you are the IRS. He spat, crinkling the page into a ball and shoving it into his pocket. I looked at him, noticing the expensive silk tie that definitely did not belong to a man who claimed his business was in the red. I am not acting like the IRS. Mark, I am acting like the person who signs our joint returns and does not want to spend a decade in a federal jumpsuit. I replied, leaning against the door frame with my arms crossed. He laughed. A jagged, nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. You handle the small stuff, the grocery budgets and the utility bills. So let me handle the real money, he said, stepping closer to try and tower over me. I did not flinch, because I had already seen the name Brooke Dawson listed as the primary consultant on that $250,000 project. Does handling the real money involve paying a real estate agent like Brooke $42,000 in consulting fees for a house that was already sold? I inquired, my tone dripping with a sarcasm that cut through his bravado. His eyes widened for a split second, a flicker of genuine fear passing over his features before he masked it with a sneer. Brooke is the best in the business. And you are just jealous because she actually understands the risks I take. He growled, grabbing his truck keys from the counter. I watched him walk toward the door, his heavy boots thumping against the hardwood floors I had paid for. Risk is one thing, Mark, but stupidity is a liability I cannot afford to carry on my balance sheet, I said to his retreating back. He slammed the door so hard the framed photos of our wedding rattled on the wall. But I was already heading toward my laptop. The audit of our life had officially begun, and I knew exactly where to find the skeletons he had hidden in the drywall. Dinner that evening felt like a deposition where the witness didn't realize he was being recorded. Mark sat across from me, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon that cost $300 a bottle, while he picked at the organic steak I had prepared. Construction costs are through the roof, Diana, and I'm staring at a massive shortfall on the West Side project, he muttered, finally looking up with a rehearsed expression of exhaustion. I took a slow sip of water, watching him over the rim of my glass before setting it down with deliberate precision. That's strange, because the market index for lumber dropped last month. Yet your expense reports show you are paying $15,000 for a shipment that should only cost $5,000. I noted, my voice devoid of any warmth. He slammed his fork down, the clatter echoing against the marble countertop. I didn't ask for a lecture on market trends. I asked for a solution. And that solution is the $50,000 sitting in your 401k account, he demanded, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure entitlement. I leaned back, a small, mirthless smile playing on my lips. My retirement fund is not a slush fund for your bad bookkeeping, Mark, and it certainly isn't a bailout for your consultants, I replied, letting the word consultant hang in the air like a threat. He let out a harsh mocking laugh, gesturing vaguely at the kitchen around us. You just sit here in the AC, clicking buttons while I'm out there in the 90-degree heat building a legacy for us. So don't you dare talk to me about where my money goes. He barked, leaning across the table until I could smell the alcohol on his breath. You aren't building a legacy. You are building a paper trail. And I'm the only person in this house who knows how to read it. I whispered, my gaze never wavering from his. His phone, lying face up on the table, buzzed with an incoming call from Brooke Dawson, her name flashing like a neon sign of betrayal. He scrambled to grab it. But not before I caught the preview of a text message that mentioned the plan to shed the dead weight by the end of the fiscal year. Go ahead. Take the call. Mark, I'm sure your real estate expert has plenty to say about the $120,000 you just moved out of our joint savings, I said, watching his hand tremble slightly as he hit the ignore button. You're getting paranoid in your old age, Diana. And frankly, it's exhausting to be around someone who treats a marriage like a forensic audit. He snapped, pushing his chair back with a violent screech. I watched him stand up, his silhouette casting a long, distorted shadow across the dining room. A marriage is a partnership, Mark, but what you're running is a shell company, and I'm about to file a very public liquidation, I countered, my tone as sharp as a scalpel. He didn't answer, instead stalking out of the room to the safety of his home office, leaving me alone with the cold remains of a dinner that symbolized our dead union. I pulled my laptop closer, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as I prepared to turn his brazenness into his greatest liability. By midnight, the house was a tomb of secrets, and I was the one exhaling the dust. I sat in my darkened office, the glow of my screen reflecting off my glasses as I bypassed the administrative locks on Mark's cloud storage. You really should have learned that a CPA sees through digital firewalls as easily as a screen door. Mark, I whispered to the empty room, watching as folders labeled job costs populated my drive. I didn't find building materials. I found a meticulously organized fraud scheme involving $450,000 in padded invoices and kickbacks. Every time he claimed he was buying premium cedar for a deck, he was actually purchasing industrial scrap and pocketing the $12,000 difference in cash. The next morning, I cornered him in the garage while he was loading his F-150 with tools he no longer had the integrity to use. I was just looking over the receipts for the Oak Street flip. And it's fascinating how we paid for 3 roofs, but the house only has 1, I said, leaning against the workbench with a folder tucked under my arm. He froze, a heavy nail gun in his hand, before turning around with a sneer that didn't quite hide the tremor in his fingers. Construction is a dirty business, Diana. And sometimes you have to move numbers around to keep the crews happy. So stay in your lane, he grumbled, trying to push past me. I didn't move an inch, my eyes locking onto his with the precision of a laser level. Lying to your wife is a personality flaw, Mark. But lying to the IRS about $450,000 in taxable income is a felony that carries a 10-year minimum, I countered, tapping the folder against my palm. He threw the nail gun onto the truck bed with a deafening clang that echoed off the concrete walls. You think you're so smart with your spreadsheets. But without my hustle, you'd be living in a studio apartment counting pennies for the bus, he hissed, his face inches from mine. I didn't blink, even as the heat of his anger radiated off him like an oven. I'd rather count pennies in a studio than count days in a cell, because my husband thought he was a criminal mastermind, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. He tried to grab the folder, but I stepped back into the light of the driveway where the neighbors could see us. Don't bother. I've already mirrored your iPad and sent the encrypted logs to a secure server. So every password change you make just confirms your guilt, I added, watching the blood drain from his face. "You're destroying our life for what? A sense of moral superiority?" he asked, his voice cracking as the reality of his exposure began to sink in. I adjusted my watch, noticing it was nearly time for my meeting with the forensic auditors I had quietly retained. "I'm not destroying anything, Mark. I'm just conducting an audit. And unfortunately for you, the numbers show you are completely bankrupt as a human being," I replied. Turning my back on him, I heard him kick a stack of drywall as I walked away. The sound of breaking plaster, a perfect metaphor for the home we had built together. The money trail didn't just lead to Brooke, it led to a systematic theft of our future. And I was going to ensure every cent was accounted for before the final gavel fell. I drove away from the house feeling lighter, knowing that while he was worried about the locks on his office, I was already holding the keys to his prison. I met Brooke Dawson at a high-end bistro downtown where the sunlight hit her $2,000 veneered smile just right. She sat there with a designer bag perched on the velvet chair, looking every bit the successful real estate agent she pretended to be. "I don't usually meet with the wives of my contractors, Diana. So make this quick because I have a closing at 3, she said, her voice dripping with an unearned superiority as she checked her gold watch. I didn't order a drink, instead sliding a thin, gray folder across the marble tabletop toward her manicured hands. "You should check the signature lines on those subcontractor agreements for the Oak Street property before you worry about your next commission." "Brooke," I replied, watching her confidence falter as she opened the first page. Her eyes darted across the rows of numbers, her breathing hitching in a way that told me she knew exactly which laws had been shattered. "Mark told me this was all above board. He said you were just the bookkeeper, and he handled the legal structures," she stammered, her face losing its curated glow. I leaned forward, my voice a low, lethal hum that stayed beneath the chatter of the lunch crowd. "Mark lied to you, just as much as he lied to me. But the difference is, I'm not the one whose name is on the $120,000 high-interest bridge loan used to cover his gambling debts," I stated, watching her grip the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She looked like she was about to vomit on her expensive silk blouse. "Gambling debts? He told me that money was an investment in a new development firm we were starting together," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the loan document that bore her forged signature. I tilted my head, offering her a look of pity that was as sharp as a razor. "He used your broker license to secure credit lines he couldn't get himself. And if I file my report with the IRS tomorrow, you aren't just losing your career. You are going to be his cellmate," I explained, letting the silence stretch between us until she broke. "What do you want from me, Diana? I can't pay back $120,000. "I don't have it," she pleaded, her bravado completely evaporated into desperate, shaking breaths. "I don't want your money, Brooke. I want the digital keys to the offshore account he thinks I don't know about," I demanded, sliding a thumb drive toward her. She stared at the small piece of plastic as if it were a live grenade. "If I give you those logs, he will kill me. Or worse, he will make sure I go down with him for the fraud," she said, looking around the room as if Mark might be watching from the shadows. I gripped the drive and pushed it closer to her hand. "He is already going down, Brooke. And right now you are just a passenger on a sinking ship. So decide if you want to swim or drown with a man who traded your future for a few hands of blackjack," I countered, my eyes burning into hers. She grabbed the drive with a sudden, jerky movement and shoved it into her bag. "He keeps the recovery codes in a hidden partition on his work laptop under the name Project Zeus's. But you didn't get that from me," she hissed, her eyes welling with tears of pure self-preservation. I stood up, smoothing my coat and looking down at the woman who thought she could replace me. "Thank you for the cooperation, Brooke. And just a professional tip. Next time you try to steal a husband, make sure he isn't broke and native enough to think his accountant wife doesn't audit the bedroom too, I said, leaving her trembling at the table. I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the drive in her bag already syncing data to my cloud server. The alliance of the cheaters was as flimsy as a house of cards. And I had just pulled the bottom corner. The fluorescent lights of the family court felt like a surgical theater where I was ready to operate. Mark sat at the defense table with a smirk that cost more than his integrity, leaning back as his lawyer argued for a 50-50 split of our assets, including the house my mother left me. Your Honor, my client is the backbone of the Sterling household. A man who built a business from the ground up while his wife managed simple bookkeeping from the comfort of their home, his attorney proclaimed, gesturing toward Mark as if he were a local hero. I leaned over to my lawyer, Saul Goodwin, and whispered, let him keep digging that hole, because the deeper he goes, the harder it will be for him to climb out. Saul nodded once, his expression as unreadable as a tax code. Before standing up to address the bench, we would like to introduce a different set of figures into the record. Your Honor, specifically the ones Mr. Sterling conveniently forgot to mention in his financial disclosure, Saul said, his voice cutting through the room's tension. He handed a thick stack of documents to the bailiff, and I watched Mark's smirk slowly dissolve into a mask of confusion. These records detail a series of unauthorized transfers totaling $120,000 from the marital savings account into a private cryptocurrency wallet held under the name of Brooke Dawson. Saul continued, projecting a spreadsheet onto the large screen. Mark lunged forward, his face turning a mottled purple as he hissed at his own lawyer. That money was a business investment. Diana is just trying to spin legitimate expenses into a scandal because she is bitter, he shouted, ignoring the judge's warning gavel. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer and meeting his panicked gaze with a calm that seemed to unnerve the entire room. A business investment doesn't usually include $12,000 for a luxury cruise for $2,000 or $50,000 for your associate's personal cosmetic procedures. Mark, I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone in the gallery to hear. The judge looked from the screen to Mark, her eyebrows rising as she flipped through the forensic audit I had spent weeks preparing. Mr. Sterling, these documents show you were billing your construction clients $15,000 for materials that were actually purchased for $5,000. Where is the missing $10,000 per project? The judge inquired, her tone shifting from neutral to accusatory. Mark stammered, looking toward the back of the room where Brooke was supposed to be sitting. But her seat was empty. He didn't just steal from our marriage. Your Honor, he stole from the federal government by filing fraudulent tax returns for 3 consecutive years, I added, passing a second folder to Saul. The air in the courtroom seemed to vanish as the realization of his predicament settled over Mark like a shroud. Those are private documents. You had no right to access my work files. That is a violation of my privacy, Mark roared, his composure finally snapping as he stood up and pointed a trembling finger at me. Privacy ends where criminal conspiracy begins. And as a CPA, it is my professional duty to report $450,000 in unreported income to the authorities, I countered, my eyes burning into his until he flinched. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and 3 men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence instantly silencing the room. The lead agent walked toward the bench and handed a paper to the judge while Mark watched in frozen horror. Your Honor, we are with the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, and we have a federal warrant for the arrest of Mark Sterling for tax evasion and wire fraud, the agent announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. The judge looked at the warrant and then at Mark, shaking her head with a look of pure disdain. It appears the audit is complete, Mr. Sterling, and you are deep in the red, the judge remarked, signaling for the bailiff to step behind him. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and betrayal as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You ruined everything." "Diana." "We were a team," he screamed as they began to lead him out of the courtroom. "Teams don't have a thief in the captain's chair." "Mark." "And they certainly don't use their wives as a human shield for their felonies," I said, watching him struggle against the agent's grip. He was led away, his expensive boots scuffing against the floor, leaving a vacuum of silence in his wake. Saul leaned in and checked his watch, a small smile finally breaking through his professional facade. "I think it's safe to say the property division is no longer your biggest concern, Diana," he noted, gathering his papers. I looked at the empty chair where my husband had sat 10 minutes ago, feeling the weight of 15 years finally lift off my shoulders. The forensic trail had led exactly where I knew it would. And for the first time in a decade, my life was perfectly balanced. I walked out of the courtroom not as a victim of a contractor's greed, but as the woman who had closed the books on his deception forever. The aftermath was a slow-motion car crash that Mark had spent years fueling with his own arrogance. I stood in the courthouse hallway as the federal agents moved him toward the transport van, his tailored suit now looking like a cheap costume. Brooke emerged from a side office, her face puffy from crying and her professional persona shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You told me you had everything under control. Mark, you said she was just a paper pusher who wouldn't notice a thing," she screamed, her voice cracking as she lunged toward him. Mark didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on the floor as he muttered, "I thought I had more time to move the $450,000. I thought she was still my wife. Time is the one asset you can't cook on a ledger, Mark. And as for Brooke, she's already given the FBI the encryption keys to your Project Zeus files," I said, stepping into their line of sight with a look of clinical detachment. Brooke froze, her mouth agape as she realized I had used her own self-preservation to seal the lid on Mark's coffin. "You bitch. You played me just as much as he did," she shrieked. But I only adjusted my glasses, unmoved by her desperation. "No, Brooke. I simply gave you an opportunity to mitigate your liability, and you took it like the opportunist you are," I replied, watching a second set of officers approach her with a summons. Mark finally looked up, his face a hollow shell of the man who had mocked my 401k at the dinner table. "What happens to the company, Diana? What happens to the $2 million in contracts I have pending?" he asked, his voice a pathetic whisper of its former bravado. I took a step closer, ensuring the agents heard every word of my final assessment. "The company is being liquidated to pay back the $120,000 you stole from our savings and the massive fines the IRS is about to levy against you," I explained, watching the last flicker of hope die in his eyes. "You're leaving me with nothing. Not even a shirt to my name." He choked out as they began to pull him toward the exit. "I'm not leaving you with nothing, Mark. I'm leaving you with exactly what you earned. A zero balance and a very long time to reflect on your math," I countered, my tone as final as a closing statement. He disappeared behind the heavy steel doors, and the hallway fell into a silence that felt like a fresh start. Brooke was led away in the opposite direction, her career in real estate effectively buried under a mountain of federal cooperation agreements. I walked toward the glass doors of the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflecting off the marble floors I no longer had to share with a thief. Freedom wasn't a feeling, it was a calculated result. And for the first time in 15 years, the cost of living was finally within my budget. I returned to our house alone, though it no longer felt like the crime scene it had been for the last few months. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the rattling of the printer or the heavy, drunken thuds of Mark's boots on the stairs. I poured myself a glass of the $800 vintage wine he had hidden for a celebration with Brooke. feeling the cool liquid settle against the heat of the day. To an accurate final balance, I toasted to the empty kitchen, my voice steady and devoid of the ghosts that used to haunt these walls. The bank notifications on my phone confirmed the liquidation of the construction equipment. A steady stream of credits that finally replaced the $120,000 he had drained. I sat at my mahogany desk, looking at the framed photo of my mother whose inheritance I had just saved from a con man's greed. "I told you I would protect it." "Mom," I whispered, the words feeling like the final seal on a long, exhausting contract. Healing didn't come in a wave of tears. It came in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every lie had been countered with a cold, hard fact. I watched the sunset through the window, the orange light reflecting off the clean surface of my laptop, where the folders for Mark Sterling were now moved to the archived drive. There is a specific kind of peace that only comes when you stop trying to fix someone else's broken math and start investing in your own. My life was no longer a joint venture with a liability, but a solo operation with a limitless ceiling. I took one last sip of the wine and closed my eyes, listening to the expensive, beautiful silence of a woman who finally owned her future. Thank you for following my journey of reclaiming the truth from a mountain of lies. Sometimes, the most powerful move isn't fighting louder, but staying calm until the final balance is settled. If you found strength in this story, please like and subscribe to see more. I am Diana Sterling, and I will see you in the next audit.